Hi, I'm Matthew Blades, and Learn from People Who Lived It has a great partner, ASI, or Advanced Systems Integration. They design and install cutting-edge audio and visual equipment. This woman-owned small business is big enough to find a solution for your next corporate build-out or school project, and can even slide in to service your existing system. Bring in ASI and 2 decades of AV experience. I hope you'll visit their website at asi-av.com to see their gallery of work.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
Well, hi, it's Matthew Blades, and when I created Learn from People Who Lived It, I knew at its core that it would be about the stories. I've received hundreds of messages from people just like you who have been touched by a story or been exposed to another way of thinking about things. And today's episode is a little different and 100% intentional. I come from a military family. My father was in the Army, his dad too. But it's my brother, who retired from the Army last year, that's the driver for this work. I love you, bro. When I left my job as a radio personality, I got a note from a guy named Dave. Dave's a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma. But the reason he got my attention was because he works almost exclusively with veterans. And after speaking with him, I knew that we had to start something together. And this is the beginning of that work. PTSD, suicide, and how to start the journey to healing. There's so much to discuss. So let's begin with the natural question for a guy like Dave. Why do you do this work? What about this work makes you go? What makes you tick? Why do you do this every day?
Well, I started working as a psychiatrist, 1996, 97. And I started working with veterans back around 2000. And I've been working with the veteran community for a large part of my career since that time. What gets me going? I love to see people improve and overcome things that they're struggling with. And of all the things that I deal with as far as like the spectrum of psychiatry and psychiatric illness, PTSD is one of the most treatable things, or at least one of the things that if you understand how it works and if you understand why some of the things are happening that you experience, you can make tremendous improvements. And it does me good to see that. It makes me feel good to see that.
I can imagine it does. There's a 7-year study by the VA that researchers identified the risk factors for suicide in veterans. And like I said, we're going to just jump right in. The strongest suicide risk factors were loneliness, low dispositional gratitude, which is the ability to appreciate positive aspects of life, thoughts of self-harm, and new trauma. So let's check off that list one thing at a time. The strongest suicide risk factors were loneliness. Mm-hmm. How are people experiencing loneliness?
You got a couple of things that are going on. Oftentimes when people deploy, if they leave family behind for that year, maybe a young couple that's fairly newly married, and they're deployed for that period of time, everything changes. You come back a year later, your wife, and I say wife because many times it's men, but it's also women too that deploy. But many times your spouse has figured out how to do things without you. You're excited to be home, and then that kind of fades after a while when now it's going on 3-4 weeks, and you still are restless sleeping. You're getting angry faster than you should, right? So that ends up pushing people away, and the loneliness in part comes from some of the experiences of PTSD that people have a hard time managing. But also, isolation is one of the things that's pretty common with PTSD. People pull away. People, go off to themselves and start cutting off their own support, and that gets them into trouble.
So the other one is the low dispositional gratitude, and they described it as the ability to, or the inability rather, to appreciate the positive aspects of life. And I think what we're talking about there is just the everyday, cool things that happen, right? Appreciating a great moment at work, appreciating your kid doing something in school that was really neat. And for a lot of folks, they find themselves in a place where they don't appreciate those things anymore, do they?
No, there's an aspect to this which is interesting. It's a whole kind of emerging study of moral injury. And that could be a whole nother topic by itself. But
I know you got me fascinated by those two words. I'll write that down.
But when you're on deployment, if you're in a combat deployment, you're there to fight. I mean, that's what you're there to do. And so a lot of times if things are going according to the rules, you can understand, from a personal moral point of view, I'm there to do a job, and the other person that I'm fighting against is there to fight, and may the best person win. I mean, there's an aspect of that, but sometimes things happen that shouldn't happen. People see things that happen to innocent people, to civilians, to children. And it can give you a very negative and very cynical view of the world.
Well, let me give you an example, and this is fictional, but there's a great series that a lot of people are in love with right now called Yellowstone. Kevin Costner is in it, and in it, one of his sons has got an episode where he came back from war, and he's really struggling, and his dad really pushes him on it, and finally the character gives in. He says, "You want a war story? You want a war story? I'll give you the war story." And he talks about, walking into a house where there was somebody there, and the father had his two kids and his wife at gunpoint, basically saying, if you do anything, I'm going to kill them. I mean, this is the real life scenario that was in front of this guy. And in a moment's notice, he had to take the lives of the family because they were a threat to him, right? Okay, that's fictional, but let's just say that that's a possibility. Something like that happens. Maybe that's based on reality. You're right. That's a new wiring for a brain, isn't it?
Yep. And there's interesting things that happen in the middle of a traumatic situation. There was a book that came out some years ago by Colonel Dan Grossman called On Combat. And he did another book on killing. And he talked about some of the distortions that happen in the middle of a traumatic situation. Time speeds up, time slows down. You can get tunnel vision. You can sometimes see things or think that you saw things that ended up not really happening. And so one of the distortions that I've seen a couple of times with people is you act in the moment and you had a split second to make up your mind, whether to pull the trigger or not. But in that situation, time slows down. And you start rehearsing it in your mind and going over it again. And did you do the right thing? Should you, maybe I shouldn't have pulled the trigger. I shouldn't have done this. And, now you have an infinite amount of time to rehash it in your mind and go over it and over it again. And, really you made a split decision based on your training, and there really wasn't a lot of thought involved with it at all. You perceived the threat and you did what you were trained to do. But the aftermath in terms of what people go through with their thought process can really plague them for many years. I guess if you're gonna work through it, at some point you have to let it go. You made a decision. It was the best decision that you could make at the time, and just let go of it.
I tell you, that's the best advice that you can give anybody. And it's one of those things that sounds so simple. At my retreat I went to, it was a lot of what we talked about was, there's people that have war moments, but there's people who have, real life traumatic experiences that cause PTSD for them as well. My story is at 23, my father had a heart attack in front of me, and I tried to save his life and I couldn't. That was a very, very traumatic experience, as you can imagine. Sure. And as a result, there were some wiring that took place at that ripe old age of 23, and I think I spent the next 20, 25 years not dealing with that as best I could. And I can only imagine if you're somebody who went and then had a repeated experience and you maybe had to do it again. Right. And then you're right. You're in your head. Let's go back to this study really quick. Thoughts of self-harm and new traumas are the other things that make the list. And to me, when I hear this, what I think about is what my own brother went through. I think about all the trauma that he did and had to see when he was there. And then he came home and a couple of buddies committed suicide. And, that to me is, there you go. There's a new trauma on top of the old traumas.
Mm-hmm.
So give me your thoughts on self-harm and new traumas and how they are going to impact somebody who's coming back already in kind of a tough spot.
Right. The way the brain works as far as memory, it's, you and I are pretty close in age. So you remember phonographs, records, right? Mm-hmm. The brain records everything like cutting a groove in a record. It's permanent. So you learn things a certain way, and that's what you got. If you learn how to deal with trauma at 7 years old, you learned how to deal with trauma with the tools that a 7-year-old has. And many times those solutions will persist until you deliberately change them. Now, you can deliberately change them by having a corrective experience, maybe a loving relationship or somebody, counseling situation, or somebody that gives you the space to kind of work out some of those things, and you learn other ways of coping with it. But you never erase those early tracks. You just lay down new tracks on top of them. Circling back to, dealing with new traumas, the new trauma comes on top of the old trauma. And if the only trauma that you had was during deployment, the new trauma comes on top of that. And whatever skills that you had, trying to sort that out is where you're going to default to.
Such a great articulation of that. When I went on retreat, we were a little bit more, we called it the inner child, right? As you well know about the inner child. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about. Some of us have those marks at that age, and then there you go. There's the etching in, and that's the operating system, unless we're aware of it and we work through it. And ultimately working through it means setting the event down, which, like I said, is easier said than done. I did want to point out that vets who, experience all four of these things, they're at the highest risk for suicide. Mm-hmm. And that's important to note, because if you know somebody who may be experiencing some of these things, it's a good time to say hello. It's a good time to check in. Mm-hmm. It's a good time for you to be supportive. And that's actually where I want to go next. You could probably give us a few great ways that we could be a much more supportive group of people to our loved ones who are coming back and have come back. What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong?
There's a number of different ways to handle things. So from the veterans side, open up about what you're dealing with. Talk to people that are close to you. You may not be able to tell them the specific situations that you're in. And I don't think it's necessary to go into a lot of details with a spouse or another family member. They don't need to have those images in their mind. But most people can use their imagination and know that, they saw some things that they're really struggling with. Okay, so we can start off with that. For the family members, for the people that are supporting, for the friends that are being supportive, getting together with somebody and just giving them space. You don't have to talk about like, hey, what was the deployment like? And hey, are you thinking about, all those things that happened? Just allow those silent times. Just be together and do something together. One of the great ways to talk and let somebody vent is just walking side by side, right? That's similar in some ways to the old psychoanalyst couch, right? Because the psychoanalyst was behind the patient, and the patient was free to just talk about whatever without judging or reading off of the therapist's expression, whether they're being approved or not. So you walk side by side and you just talk about whatever. And you don't have that confrontational aspect of making eye contact with each other. And it just gives the person space to work some things out. You can just listen. You don't have to necessarily have the answers to it.
Isn't that the truth? We had an episode, Want to Learn from People Who Lived It. Carrie lost her son. He was 19 years old to an accidental overdose. And the one thing she wishes she would have done was just to walk into his room and sit there until he said something. And that's what you're talking about right there. Is just giving people space, going for a walk and not saying anything, and let it come out the way it's going to, right? And then the other thing that I think is going to be real important is not to try to fix people, right? But men especially have a hard time in this space. We want to fix it. We want to make it better. And I think what's critical for most people to understand, first and foremost, is that there's nothing broken. Nothing's wrong with you, right? You have an experience, the trauma, and you're having a reaction to it. I have a friend of mine who calls it PTSR. She says you're having exactly the response you're supposed to have to that trauma. And
well, let me qualify what you're saying.
Yeah.
What does get kind of broken is the brain's reaction to danger. And that's something that never really goes back again.
Are you talking about like what happens in the amygdala with all of that stuff? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So if you're in a life-threatening situation, the brain becomes conditioned to respond quickly to anything that it perceives as a threat. And you have two completely separate systems in the brain that run in parallel to each other. So you have the limbic system, which is the automatic response, the amygdala being the danger sensor. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, right? That's the part that thinks and reasons. The limbic system with the amygdala is very fast and very nonspecific. So it's like a smoke alarm. If you blow smoke in a smoke alarm, it doesn't matter whether you blow out a match or whether the house is on fire. It's going to go off exactly the same way. And that frustrates a lot of people. A lot of people really struggle with that, and they're embarrassed that they can't control it. Maybe they reacted in anger, and then they have to try to walk it back, and they feel bad. Okay, this is like the 5th time this week I blew my top, and my family doesn't deserve this, right? So when you want to talk about things that lead to suicide, that's one of those pieces where the person feels that they can't control themselves, and they feel sad, ashamed, embarrassed, out of control, fearful, because of their reactions to things. And the spouse or the family members, it's helpful for them to understand that these things happen. Now, I'm not saying that somebody should stand there and take abuse. Right? There's ways to set limits with somebody, but you have to find a way to step back from the situation and give the person the space to calm down, and then come back and discuss whatever the issue was once everything is calmer. But overreactions, anger, inappropriate reactions in terms of intensity, those are all par for the course. And that's just because the brain is wired differently after having been exposed to danger. And you can't control it. And so you can't control the reaction, but you can modify it. I can go into more details on that if you want me to.
Yeah, I think we should, right? Because that's really important for people to get the next piece of this. Yeah, so fly off.
Yeah. So the reactions are involuntary, but there's a couple things you can do to modify the reactions. So the first thing is to recognize a pattern, right? And this is true of anybody who's dealing with post-traumatic stress. You have to take the time to learn your patterns. What situations set you off? What situations make you feel uncomfortable? What situations make you feel fearful? And it's the darndest things. People think, well, I should be able to go to the store. Like that shouldn't be a problem. But if you had to go through a village on a convoy, and somebody was there on a cell phone detonating an explosive, every time you see somebody on a cell phone, you're going to get a twinge that, they're going to set something off, right? So those reactions are automatic. But if you at least understand, oh, okay, I don't like when I see people on cell phones, especially strangers, because I don't know what they're doing, or, if you go into the supermarket, sometimes there's just so much activity, and your brain is looking for targets. Your brain is looking for threats. And if you don't know that going into the supermarket, it's going to get overwhelming. It's just too many things coming at you, too many targets to follow. And you're not thinking of this consciously. You're just kind of doing it, right? If you at least know that that's what that is, you can pregame it before you go into the situation. Say, okay, take a deep breath. Okay, I'm going into the supermarket. I just really have to get 2 or 3 things. I know what aisle I need to go to. I can get in and I can get out. everybody who's here, they're here to do the same thing. They're just shopping. Go into the store, look around. There's a woman carrying a baby. That's not a threat. There's an older gentleman pushing a shopping cart. That's not a threat, right? And just deliberately go through and identify each situation, because then that satisfies that part of the brain that's trying to keep alert to look for those threats in the environment, right? So if you go through the process and do it deliberately, it shuts that down, and then you can kind of go about your business a bit. And this is the inclination that people have, is to fight it. I shouldn't feel this way. I should just go in. I should just do it. Your brain is not going to give you any rest until you address it.
Yeah. Well, it's the very definition. I tell everybody that's the very definition of stress in your life, is when you try to fight the natural thing that's trying to happen there.
Yeah.
And we all do it. But yeah, anyways, go ahead. Yeah.
So look for patterns. Look for patterns at home in terms of things that lead to arguments with your spouse. Sometimes it could be something as stupid as, you came in, you left your shoes in the kitchen, and your wife looks at you and says, "Seriously, you're going to leave those in the kitchen?" And then boom, all of a sudden, anger off the charts and everything, because it was a confrontation. Now, albeit a minor confrontation, but nonetheless, the brain registers that as a threat. And then boom, the adrenaline is pouring, and now you're overreacting to things. So if you can identify the patterns, then you can get ahead of them. There's an example. I worked with a Vietnam vet one time that he was married to a woman. This was a relationship that he developed later in his life. And they had an understanding between each other. He was prone to anger. He would start to escalate, when they would have a disagreement. And as soon as he kind of crossed a certain line, she would just quietly step away from the conversation, go to the hall closet, pull out a pair of red sneakers and hand it to him. And when he got the red sneakers in his hand, that was the sign that you're going a little too far. You need to put those red sneakers on and go for a walk. Mm. And when you're done, and when you come back from your walk, we can continue this conversation. Now, in that state of being agitated and angry, you can't have that conversation. You can't have the conversation of, you need to stop. I need you to go take a walk. He's not going to process those words at that point, because he's just, he's in fight or flight.
Red. He's seeing red.
Right. So that was a little code that they worked out between themselves. And the important thing is he was going along with it. He was accepting of that, right? You can't do this unilaterally. It has to be an agreement between two people. Otherwise it's, you've just given them another reason to get ticked off.
Yeah. Well, and it's such what a neat little thing to have between each other too. And what I like about that example so much, Dave, is that it's such a tangible thing that another couple could institute tonight, right? They really could. They'd be like, "Oh my God, heard that. Love that. Let's do that."
Yeah.
What we're talking about with the brain and everything, I'm a big meditator. I've been practicing transcendental meditation for a number of years, and there's been a number of studies that have been linking TM to PTSD, because what TM ultimately does is get you out of the amygdala and get you back into the prefrontal cortex, where things are normally operating. I'll tell people all the time, what vets are experiencing is what you just said. Going to the grocery store for them feels like a life and death situation, and we all know that's not the case.
Right.
And so I love the idea that there's some cool things like meditation that we can do that can settle the brain down and get us into that space. So you may be able to speak to what the meditation is doing to the brain to allow it to get out of one place and into the next.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there. What I like about meditation and mindfulness practices in general, when it comes to PTSD, is giving you the ability to gain control over your thoughts, gain control over the thought process. Because a lot of times what happens is, something will set you off, and then your mind is racing a million miles an hour and trying to process everything that's going on, and trying to, look for threats and look for the exits and, a million things. And if you practice mindfulness, if you practice meditation on a daily basis, you become conditioned through repetition to get your thoughts under control. Now, it's not going to work perfectly if you get set off, but at least you have a starting off point. You can take a deep breath. You can focus on your breathing. If you're thinking about your breathing and thinking about taking breaths, guess what you're not thinking about? All the other stuff that's going on, right? So it serves a bit as a distraction. The other thing too, especially when you're focusing on the breathing aspect of it. So usually what we recommend is you take a deep breath in and you exhale for twice as long, right? So if you breathe in for yep,
you got it.
And there's a neat little trick about why that works to calm you down.
I love it. This is like a Navy SEALs use this, guys. Like literally, that's what I'm saying. Like, don't think this is some foo-foo thing. Like dudes are in combat and this is the method they use to calm the brain down so they can go to sleep.
Right. So there's a normal fluctuation in your heart rate when you breathe, right? So when you inhale, your heart speeds up a little bit. And when you exhale, your heart slows down a little bit. Right.
Okay.
So when you double the exhale, you're applying more brake than gas pedal. Right. So if your heart is racing because something just set you off and now you're taking nice slow exhales, you're putting the brake pedal on, you're slowing that heart rate down and getting things back under control again. You do that for about 10 breaths and things are calmed down. You still have that weird feeling from all the adrenaline, but the adrenaline is going to take several minutes to get out of your system. But at least for the moment, you've gotten your heart rate back down to a more normal rate, more manageable.
You bet.
But that's something anybody can do that.
I teach it to everybody I know. I say you breathe in for 4, you hold it for a second, you breathe out for 8, and then you do that again and again and again. And if you do it 4 times, you literally can chill out in less than 60 seconds. I mean, really, it can have that kind of a positive impact. So it's great. What other things are you seeing in the world of psychiatry that are helping people with PTSD that maybe folks need to know about?
Sometimes medication is necessary.
Yeah.
I know a lot of veterans are suspicious about taking medications or they don't want to, have to rely on something. But the problem when it comes to depression is sometimes people get stuck. And the way that people get stuck is when you start to become depressed, clinically depressed, you start withdrawing from people. You start withdrawing from things that you enjoy doing. You become more disengaged from things. And, everybody has things that they like to do when they feel down to perk themselves up a bit. So if you were, looking forward to something and it got canceled last minute, you feel, disappointed and people have coping mechanisms. They have things that they like to do, go take a drive in the car, eat a dish of ice cream.
Go for a walk, go work out.
Whatever.
Right.
When you start losing interest, even in the things that usually make you feel good, now what's the mechanism that you're going to get unstuck? Right. So you start throwing things overboard that would normally be useful for you, right? Or getting together with friends. It's too much of a burden to get together with my friend. Well, now you feel down and you didn't do something to get yourself to feel better. And then you're stuck, right? So sometimes
I'll bring it back to where we started, right? You make that decision. Now you make yourself lonely, which is one of the biggest contributors to. Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah. So sometimes antidepressant medication can be necessary to kind of pull it out. So,
and isn't it also important to note that the first one might not be the best one or the right one, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that's so important to say to people?
You make your best guess, and I could tell you as a psychiatrist, you make your best guess as to what the person might respond to. So like, for instance, if somebody is having a lot of restless sleep, you might go with a more sedating antidepressant and put it at nighttime so that if they're going to have side effects from it, those side effects kind of match with other things that they're dealing with. Or if you have somebody that's really slowed down, they're sleeping half the day, they have no energy, you might go with something that is a little bit more perky, that would give them a little bit more of a boost of energy. But, you make your best guess. And this is where, medicine becomes an art and not a science. The science tells you what medications work, but the art part comes from figuring out what works for that particular person and all the other things that go along with it.
Yeah, well, I know for me, I went through some mood swings for a while and worked with my psychiatrist on a couple of different medications. And the only reason I mention this is because the first couple for me almost enraged me more. They brought on feelings of like, it made it worse. And, and so maybe there's somebody who's taking a medication and they're trying to be a good patient because doc's telling them to, but yet they're kind of feeling worse, and they don't, they don't feel like they should articulate that. And I'm telling you, you should, right? Like let your doctors know if you are experiencing, because by and large, and I have landed now on one that works for me, right? When you land on it, everything kind of, it's like, whoa, what happened? Right? Like the chemistry is right again, and the world kind of comes and gets into flow.
I would tell you the general rule of thumb is unless the side effects are completely unbearable, give it 3 to 5 days. There's a lot of nuisance-y side effects with medications that, when you take the first dose, it's like, okay, that was a little unpleasant, but then, once your body adjusts to it, it tends to go away. Anything that's lasting over 5 to 7 days is going to be there probably indefinitely. And if it's not tolerable, don't tolerate it. Call your doc, try to get on a different medication. There's plenty of other things out there to try.
Let's talk about TBIs a little bit, because that's the thing that happened for a lot of folks over in Iraq, Afghanistan, and even back in the the 70s with Vietnam. When somebody experiences a traumatic brain injury, which is a significant blow to the head or to the body, what are the repercussions outside? And we know the symptoms, right? We know we're going to get headaches, we're going to be tired, we're going to be drowsy, we know that. What's happening in the moment?
Yeah. TBI has been one of the most interesting things that I've had to deal with all this. Every TBI is a one-off. Depends on where you got hit. Depends on what the injury was. So a lot of things that we see pretty commonly are blast-related injuries. You just get hit with that shock wave from an explosion. And you can do a CAT scan, you can do an MRI, and you're not going to find anything. You're not going to see anything structurally wrong, because the damage is not from damaging the nerves. The damage is from disconnecting the little tiny connections at the end of the nerves, right? So you have the dendrites at the end of the nerves, and every nerve has, thousands of other little connections to neighboring nerves. And those are the things that get disrupted. So it takes a long time for that to rewire. And you can see some unusual things that happen as a result. So again, depending on where the injury was, but I've seen things ranging from mood changes, depression. I've seen people become manic and start doing impulsive things and taking risks that they never used to take, kind of uncharacteristic for them.
Interesting.
I've seen things that look kind of like ADD, where people just can't focus. They can't concentrate on things. They're scattered. They're all over the place. And some of the symptoms kind of overlap with PTSD, so some of the mood changes, behavioral changes, that people see with PTSD can go with TBI. It's almost indistinguishable at times.
Let me ask you a question. When you're visiting with people and you have a chance to be around the work, are folks by and large good at articulating, communicating their feelings and thoughts, or is that something people struggle with?
Yeah, people struggle.
Yeah. What could we
do? For a number of reasons.
Yeah, right. Because that's the spot where it's like, how do we help people be better communicators to you, right? Because ultimately you're there to help and serve. I mean, it's clear to me in the 30 minutes we've been on, right, that your heart is in the right place for all of this stuff. So clearly you're there to help and to serve. And if I can't do a good enough job of articulating and communicating what's going on in my body and my head, I don't give you the best deck, do I? I don't give you the best hand there. And so how can I be a better communicator if I'm going through this right now?
Bring a spotter.
Yeah.
That's the best. Bring a spotter, somebody that knows you really well, spouse, family member, your mom, somebody that can identify some of the things that you're not able to see. It's very tough observing your own behavior from the point of view of being inside your body. You do things, you react to things automatically, you do things thoughtlessly. I mean, everybody does stuff by habit, and you don't really think it through, and you don't really think through how it affects other people until they speak up and say something about it. So I encourage people to bring other family members in for visits. Not every time, sometimes you don't want to talk about things in front of family members, but to have somebody that is dialed in with what we're doing and kind of understands what we're trying to accomplish and the direction that we're trying to go with treatment, and do some education to tell them what to look for, give them some tips and some tricks for kind of managing some of the ups and downs with it. But then you get better information back, which is infinitely more useful than just trying to, guess.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I could imagine, you just hear things like, I don't know, I feel off, or I don't know, I'm just angry all the time, or I don't know, I just don't want to be around anybody, and it's hard for many, including myself sometimes, to kind of articulate to people what's going on. The other thing that I read was about how vets are taking their lives, which was firearms, suffocation, and poisoning. You see a lot of this, and how do you keep mending your broken heart when you hear about stuff like this?
Yeah. It's firearm suicides. You're talking about people that are trained to use firearms. Many of them still have guns at home, be it a gun that they used when they were deployed, or they don't feel safe at home, so they want to have firearms around. So it's a readily available means and a definitive means, and that's part of the problem. This is where it's helpful to work with family, and if the family notice changes, I've had to negotiate with people, that are maybe not suicidal, but just struggling with depression, have that conversation about the firearm. It's like, can somebody else hold on to that for you? Can you, give it to your cousin for a while, just until we get the medication squared away, until we get things, ironed out and you're feeling better. I don't, and I'll be frank with them. I don't want you to have a convenient, ready, lethal means available to you, just if you have that dark moment, because everybody has them from time to time, that, questioning kind of what's going on, or, if things are going to ever get better. And you just want to give people enough space to be able to see through to the next step. And if they have something that's readily available and quick and lethal, they may act in a moment where if they had some more time, maybe we could have gotten to a better place.
Well, and you said something again for maybe the third or fourth time that I think it's really important to kind of reiterate, which is allowing space, giving space. Seemingly the best thing that we can do for each other is to create space for us to feel what we need to feel around each other. Military families are different, and I know that because I grew up in one, right? My father was military until he passed away. My brother, as I said, was in. My grandfathers were in. And there seems to be a different set of supportive rules in place for military families. They seem to be like, well, this comes with it, or, well, this is what we do, or, well, we got to just pull up the bootstraps and this is what it takes. And
right. Suck it up, buttercup.
There is a little bit of that, right? You know what I'm talking about. And, and I just wonder, as far as we've come with regard to mental and spiritual wellness and healing and all the things, right? What can we do to get over that hurdle? What can we do to get over that hurdle that we don't have to suck that up, that we can go and we can love our country. We can do what we want to do. We can get our wounds and we can come back and heal them.
Yeah. You're not on deployment forever. You're only on deployment for a year, right? Sometimes it gets extended, right? 18 months, 2 years tops, but you're not on deployment forever. And so the training and the conditioning that make you effective for that deployment is not a good strategy to live your entire life. At some point, you have to start toning things back down again, bring things down to a more appropriate civilian level of functioning. So yes, suck it up. You got to do that for when you're deployed. If you get injured, you got to keep pushing on. You can't stop and feel bad about what just happened. You got to keep moving. When you get back home, when the deployment's over, you got to change your fighting style. You have to go at things a little bit differently. At that point, then it's no longer a sprint, it's a marathon, and you got to find a pace that's going to work over a long period of time. And I think that's where people get stuck, is, and I see this probably more with some of the Marines and some of the Special Forces guys. You know, if you have to work at an elite level of conditioning, and any sign of weakness will wash you right out of the program, and all of the hard work that you've done to get to that point is gone in a day. There's a very strong incentive to not show weakness, to not show when you're struggling with something. And I see folks have a hard time transitioning back when they've gone through that level of training, you know, and even among their buddies, you know, you're doing, oh yeah, I'm fine. Yeah. Doing okay. Yeah. You're kind of drinking a little too much, you know, and kind of brush it off and minimize it a bit. Without any judgment, just take a look at what's happening, right? You're not sleeping well. You're only getting 2 hours of sleep, and then you're pacing the house for the rest of the night. Mm-hmm. You're waking up in a sweat. You're waking up with vivid nightmares so loud that you're waking up the whole house with your screaming. That's a thing that's happening, right? So whatever you want to call it, you know, however you want to look at it, that is happening. That is a fact, right? What do you want to do with that? You know, and you can go through and make a list of a lot of things like that. You know, you're too angry, you're drinking too much, you're getting anxious and sweaty hands in places that really, you know, should be pretty easy to deal with. Just deal with what is, and be willing to discuss it, because you can strategize, you can find a solution to it if you can talk about it.
You've said a million things. I think that will make it helpful. How do we help anybody who just, and listen, I was in some dark days myself, and I had that feeling of like, man, I was driving home. I'll tell you the story. I was 4 months out of back surgery. I was driving home. I was already maybe a year and a half into my misery. And I had this thought, I'll never be happy again. I'm driving home from work. I said, I'll never be happy again. And then the really scary thing about it, Dave, was that I became okay with it. I said to myself things like, well, you're a dad now and you got kids and this is what you do and you suck it up and you go to work and this is the job and you're married and you do this, right? And that's the conversation that I had with myself. And there was a point where I got to where I said, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to set this down. This feels that real and it feels that heavy that I don't think I'm ever going to be able to put this thing down. And so I really come from a place of compassion and understanding when somebody feels that way. How or what's the best way that you help folks in that space?
Yeah. So you have to realize that when you're in the midst of depression, your brain is going to perceive everything through a negative lens. Mm-hmm. So it's just like putting on blue shaded glasses. Everything is going to look blue. Everything is going to be tinted blue. Everything is going to be a various shade of blue, right? So when you're in that depressed space, especially when it's a clinical depression, I'm not saying just disappointed with something, but when it's a clinical depression, your brain is going to distort everything to be the most negative it possibly can be. My kids don't like me. I'm doing terrible at my job. It's only a matter of days now before my boss fires me. My career is in the crapper. It's never going to go anywhere. There's no point in even bothering anymore. My friends don't want to hear my BS. So you can get into this real negative self-talk, and everything is kind of distorted by that. So if you realize that you're depressed, you can kind of play a trick on yourself a little bit by stepping back from it and saying, okay, I'm listening to myself and I'm hearing myself talk about all this negative stuff. That's a distortion. That's not reality. And if you can find a way to take an inventory of what's actually good in your life, and just look at it on paper, or discuss with somebody that you care about. Tell me what's good about my life. What's good in my life, and let them help you make that list, and realize that your bias is going to be toward the negative and seeing the most darkest aspect of it. That will get better over time. When you pull out of the depression, things will be more balanced and come back into focus again. And there's another piece of this too, which we had kind of touched on before, but I wanted to go back to it when you were talking about,
please.
how different people cope with things. When you're dealing with trauma, you can either bend or you can break. If you don't bend, you will eventually break. And what I mean by bend is if you have to have things in your life a very particular way and reality doesn't match with that, you got a problem. There's a mismatch there. If you can come to some level of acceptance and say, okay, I know this is what I want for my life. I know this is where I feel like I need to be, but this is where I actually am. Then you can start plotting a path to get there. But if you stubbornly hold on to a version of your life that doesn't exist, and it has to be this way. It has to go back to the way it was before I deployed. I have to, be able to control this or that. You are going to break at some point. You have to learn to deal in reality, and the reality can be very painful. It can be very embarrassing.
Well, but like you said earlier, right? We're records, right? We got etched. You don't get to it doesn't rewrite. It's just you got a new record, and so you got to, and so you like you said,
you can always change it, but you have to first see what's going on and see what you're dealing with, in reality, in real time, and then you can start plotting a course to change it and to get better. And we can always do better.
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of times, like bringing a spotter, or kind of looking at yourself. And for anybody that's into Eastern religion like Buddhism, I studied for a few years, and one of the things that they teach you is this thing called Mahumadra, which basically means stepping outside yourself, watching yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's the idea that you're meditating and you're watching yourself meditating. But then you can, once you become good at that practice, you can sort of take that into your personal life, where you can watch yourself operating in life to see how you're doing. And so you said that a couple of times. It made me think of that neat little anecdote. And I like the flavor of that story. And I like that idea of, oh yeah, I can kind of step outside myself. I can watch myself operating in this scenario to see how I'm doing and take a mental checklist. Yeah. And I also like this bit that you're talking about being real cognitive about the situation, right? Being very methodical about it. I'm in a grocery store. There's going to be people with phones. That person's not a threat. I love that stuff. That's real. That's tangible. I can put my hand on that bit of information and use it the next time I'm out, which is, I think, what you seem to do very well. Yeah. I can see why you do what you do.
I think what people don't realize is you actually can step outside of yourself, in the sense that, we all do things automatically. The way that you interact with people, the way that you get upset by certain things, those are all things that happen automatically. And those come from earlier experiences that became ingrained, and then they become a part of how you react to things. But you can always, after something happens, pause for a second and say, well, wait a second, I got really pissed. Why did I get so angry about that? And just take a moment to reflect on your own reaction to things and say that really wasn't called for. I don't know why I got so upset by that. And so you're then taking that distance back and kind of looking at the situation. And, even if you don't come up with an immediate answer for why it happened, similar to the mindfulness and similar to the meditation and the breathing, practicing stepping outside of yourself like that and just looking at what happened and trying to understand what happened, you'll start to get insight over time. You'll start to say, this happened, and this is really similar to the last time that happened about 3 weeks ago. And what was it about those two things that were similar? Oh yeah, that when this happened, it reminded me of this. And you could start putting it together after a while, but you got to put the work in. Isn't
that the truth? And then let me give them even more wind in their sails, right? So many of them used that very skill in combat. They would walk in, they would assess, they would see what was going on in a situation. For so many of our vets, you're so good at it. You're so good at really taking inventory and figuring out what's good and what's around you. There is another area that popped into my head that I thought was worth discussing. And, we've been at it for almost an hour here, but I still want to bring this up. Let's talk about folks who had something happen to them before the war. Okay. So they might have had, my brother's a great example. He was 20 when we lost our dad, and he was there with us when that happened. And then he went to war, and then he had some more stuff. Are we add more records here, or what's the effect of that in somebody's life? A pre-trauma and then another one.
Yeah. There's so many different aspects of this to take a look at.
I'm sure there is.
So one is when people experience trauma on deployment on top of a childhood trauma. When they come back, a lot of times the PTSD symptoms tend to be worse. So they may end up having more depression, more mood swings than had they not had the earlier trauma. Sometimes the intrusive thoughts or the ruminating thoughts, just kind of going over things over and over again, that can be a problem. If there was any aspect of the deployment trauma that was similar in any way to the childhood trauma, sometimes the thought process that goes through people's minds is something along the lines of, I must be a magnet to attract this type of thing to me. This happened once before, and now here I am experiencing it again. And so there must be something wrong with me that this keeps coming my way, and you can get into like a whole negative thing in your thoughts with that. And if there were maladaptive coping strategies, maybe hitting the alcohol too hard or doing risky things, if that happened with the earlier trauma, the pre-deployment trauma, those can be kind of the default places that people go afterwards in terms of trying to cope with things. I mean, let's face it, alcohol is easy to get hold of. And if you haven't slept for 4 nights, tying one on, you'll pass out and you'll wake up several hours later. It won't be a restful sleep. You're going to be really hungover, but at least you weren't staring at the ceiling all night. So it's available, so people go to it. But the problem is once you start using that as a coping strategy over a longer period of time, you become addicted to it, and you quietly cross this line where you're no longer in control. And when you think you want to stop, you're not able to stop. So that's not a good way to manage. But I see a lot of people struggle with that after deployment. And I think it is worse if you're stacking a new trauma on top of an old.
There are some bright spots out there, and they're worth talking about. There are fewer veterans dying from suicide in 2019 than in 2018, reflecting the lowest raw count of veteran suicides since 2007. COVID-related data continues to emerge and clarify that it's not indicating an increase in suicides with regard to veteran suicides. That's the stat. Do you see that? Is that a truth in your life? You feel like COVID hasn't really done much to make that situation worse, or is COVID exposed more than we think?
So I think for the regular population, COVID has created a lot of isolation, cut people off from friends, cut people off from families, caused people to miss major events in their life. So I think psychologically, COVID, especially with the lockdowns and the isolation, has been a real negative for regular people. Interestingly enough, when we started treating veterans over telemedicine and started talking with people and kind of checking in with them and finding out how they're managing with the isolation, I was surprised that a number of people said, this is kind of funny because the entire world caught up to what I've been doing for the last 15 years. And they said it with a sense of humor.
Makes perfect sense.
Isolation, yeah, no problem. I've been doing this forever. This is fine. I don't mind. I have extra food on hand. I don't like shopping anyway. I usually have Amazon delivery or whatever. And even with situations that are dangerous and threatening, that's where people thrive. If you've been on deployment and you've dealt with danger for an entire year, if the world is falling down around you, you're the guy of the hour. You know what to do. Instinctively, you know what to do. The world falling down, they're going to be right at home with that. Yep.
Nothing new. We still have between 17 and 25 vets a day that, take their own life. And I have a buddy who came on my radio show once upon a time, and he said something so profound and so simple. He said suicide is a permanent is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. If I'm hurting and I'm watching this right now, what's step one, Dave? What's step one?
Reaching out to somebody that you trust, reaching out to a family member, a friend, and say, I'm struggling. I'm having a hard time. That's the first step. Things can always get better. I can't think of a situation where suicide is necessary. Things can always get better. It's just sometimes the path to get there is very hard. But you don't have to do it alone. If you have people in your life, you have people that can come alongside of you and be a support to you. And even if you're by yourself, if you can get in with a therapist and get in with a psychiatrist to help you, there's people out there that can help.
There it is. Well, listen, I think this is just the beginnings of the two of us. And if you ever write a book, I think you should call it Red Sneakers. It's a great story. I love.
That's one of my favorite stories.
Oh, it's just. All right, Dave. Well, listen, thank you for being with us tonight and for just sharing everything that you've learned along the way. And if I can just continue to make you louder, please let me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. If this ends up reaching out to people and kind of getting people to think about their situation, I think it'll do a lot of good.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1. To help you feel less alone. 2. Encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3. When you're ready, share your story with us.
Thank you for listening to Learn from People Who Lived It. A reminder again that ASI, or Advanced Systems Integration, designs and installs cutting-edge audio and visual equipment. This woman-owned small business is big enough to find an AV solution for your next boardroom, classroom, council chambers, or courtroom. Bring in ASI and 2 decades of AV experience. Visit ASI-AV.com to see their gallery of work.